Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are to you. My name is David Goodman. I'm the Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Welcome to this month's International Research webinar, which is to be given by Tim Oakes on infrastructural urbanism and chaired and moderated by Professor Yingye Guo. Before we start, may we recognise the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is based, their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that neither land nor water have ever been ceded. When you are thinking to ask a question after Professor Oakes has finished, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen, and Professor Guo will choose your questions from there. So now over to Yingye Guo, and I'll shut up.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Tim Oakes. We have done a fair bit of work together. I remember many years ago, came to Sydney as a visiting scholar at UTS. I was there, and before that, we were attending the provincial China workshops. Tim is a professor of geography at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Currently, he's a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Oslo's Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages. He has published extensively on China's international urbanization, especially rural and urban development, cultural governance, and changing spaces of leisure and consumption in China. Of his many publications, I remember one, Translocal China, which I go back to again and again. It's a very useful book. It's really inspiring work. I'm just looking forward to this talk today, Tim, and over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Yingye. It's great to see you, virtually, and great to see you, David, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I wish I was there in Sydney in person, although I'm having a great time here in Oslo. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the presentation. I have some slides to keep me on track here. Hopefully you can all see that. So just want to recognize that much of this work comes out of a project that is funded by the Henry Luce Foundation that I've been running since 2018 called China Made. And so that's where some of the funding comes from. And let me make sure I can advance my slides. Okay, so I'm going to try to, it looks like a lot, but I'll try to move through this quickly. It's a fairly conceptual talk. I don't know, I enjoy talking about theory, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concepts and ideas that I'm working with around infrastructural urbanism and the ideas of infrastructure space. The China Made project that this work came out of has been focused on looking at kind of an infrastructural studies perspective on Chinese statecraft and development, both within China and outside of China. So I've been thinking about these things quite a bit over the past several years. So I'll talk about some of those conceptual approaches that I've been working with, and then talk a little bit about the research that I was doing prior to the pandemic in Guizhou on some of these issues. And then we'll kind of wrap that up with some broader ideas. So I want to start with this image by Billy Kwok from the New York Times. It's one of my favorite pictures, and it really encapsulates, I guess, or expresses one of the kind of key ideas that has really, animated a lot of my thinking about China recently, and that is this shift from industrialization as the purpose of development, the kind of endpoint of visions of modernity, a shift from that to the urban, or to urbanization as the endpoint of the modernization project. And in many ways, as many scholars have been pointing out over the past really couple decades, that urbanization and the urban have in many ways become the purpose of the state in China. So that if prior to the reforms, the vision of modernity was something like this, the image that you see on the left there, it has really shifted to one of not only industrialization, but a shift from production to consumption, a shift from the factory as the key space of the socialist project to the city as the key space of that. And so and I've written previously about one take that I have on this, which is the idea of the urban as an ideological project in China, and that the ideas of civilization and development and modernity are expressed ideologically in this kind of rendering of kind of this is where we're going, right, with urbanization and with development, this kind of ideal city, an eco-city, a smart city, a city that is efficient, that is everything that the sprawling cities of socialism were not up until that point. And of course, with lots of money that's been laid out for that, and architects like Zaha Hadid and others, a lot of that vision has been in many ways realized in certain monumental forms, figurative architecture that draws a lot of attention to itself, those kinds of things. But a broader question that could be asked is whether or not the city, this kind of ideal, dreamy kind of city, is really the end point of the kind of urbanization that's actually happening in China. Often it looks more like this. This is Lanzhou New Area, where you have, and this is kind of a whimsical image for me, I guess, but it captures the more kind of infrastructural basis of urbanization that's actually happening on the ground in China, where you have an infrastructural grid laid out of wide lanes and boulevards, high-speed rail often being part of that on the peripheries or the peri-urban areas just outside of the city, and then you get whatever kind of development actually kind of happens along those roadsides at the intersections, at the places where people kind of take advantage of whatever opportunities the new infrastructures that have been laid out might create. In this case, you've got a little theme park being developed with replicas of various monuments around the world, and there's some kind of transformer statue there on the left, and so on. So this is more the kind of urbanization pattern that you see actually on the ground. And so part of what I'm after when I say toward a materialist reframing of urbanization in China, the materialist, that term I'm thinking is not historical materialism. It's not materialism in the kind of the Marxist sense. It's materials in terms of materiality, in terms of actual landscapes, in terms of the actual morphology and the actual form of the land that's taking shape as a form of urbanization emerges that's infrastructurally driven, and that is quite different from the kind of ideological rendering of the urban, of the kind of the ideal city that is emerging, that has been articulated by the state. This is an urbanization that has been called horizontal as opposed to vertical, right? So if you saw in the image of Tianfu New District, a very kind of verticalized idea of the city, what you often find with a more kind of infrastructural pattern of urbanization is a much more horizontal pattern of urbanization, a kind of a less centripetal and more centrifugal pattern that's more rhizomic or polymorphic, if you will. an urbanization of archipelagos, a kind of a horizontal form, as I've said. These are spaces of transportation grids, logistics hubs, supply chain networks, data centers, e-commerce fulfillment warehouses, and other heterogeneous land uses, diverse settlement types, and so on. A Foxconn assembly plant here, a warehouse there, vestiges of agricultural production going on in other places, all mixed up kind of in the same general, largely infrastructural space. So if China had a period of what we call under-urbanization up until the reform era, where the city and urbanization were viewed as an unfortunate byproduct of industrialization that needed to be limited as much as possible, and the socialist work unit was the basis on which those kinds of patterns were developed. Then with the reforms, you entered a period of rural urbanization, particularly in the early 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s, a kind of an uncontrolled, chaotic form of rural urbanization that was driven by township and village enterprise development, particularly along the coastal provinces, places like Zhejiang and Fujian, Jiangsu, and so on. That was replaced by a much more municipal-centric or top-down form of urbanization that emerged later in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, driven largely by the success of Pudong District after it was established and took off. And what I'm suggesting is that we could then say a new phase of what I'm calling infrastructural urbanization has really taken over. Since the more city-centered form of urbanization that's captured in this image on the right led to a spate of what has been identified by intellectuals in China as urban sickness, a kind of an urbanization craze, a chaotic period of top-down urbanization that wasted a lot of money and that needed to be reined in by the state. And so new patterns of urbanization that have been happening, particularly since the 2014 kind of launch of the new urbanization plan, has really been this more kind of infrastructural form of urbanization. And as I've mentioned, that I'm interested in kind of a more materialist-centered analysis of this that focuses on what happens, how landscapes of urbanization are actually being formed from these infrastructural material forms that are laid out, these large boulevards and other sorts of infrastructural configurations that are laid out in anticipation of some sort of urban form that will follow. And I'm interested in this in part because there's in urban studies beyond China, there's been increased interest over the past decade or so in rethinking the materiality of cities and of urbanization. Just one example, the urban historian Chris Otter, in an essay probably about a decade or so ago, he noted that urban studies had long privileged the immaterial dimensions of the city. That is the idea, and this, you can go back to Karl Marx or somebody like David Harvey, critical scholars that are focused on the abstract processes, for example, of capital, rather than the physical texture of urban space. And the city kind of being reduced to the outcome of more important abstract processes of capital, rather than paying attention to the actual built form of the city and how that how the dematerialization of the city in our analysis leads us to miss a lot of what's going on with things like unequal access to resources and other forms of inequality or issues around social justice or whatever, however you want to think about that. So returning to kind of a more kind of material agency of urban infrastructures has been an outcome of efforts to kind of rethink that kind of materiality, rethink cities in more material material terms. So we might then ask the question, right? So what might we learn about urbanization by foregrounding materiality and infrastructure, and what might we learn about urbanization in China? And one of the things that comes out of this, I think, is a kind of an analysis of urbanization in which the city no longer makes that much sense. And by extension, the countryside as well. This dichotomy of urban and rural are problematic when we're looking at these kinds of spaces of urbanizing China that we see going on right now. The role of infrastructure in the state's infrastructure power becomes fundamental to how urbanization happens, or becomes front and center of our analysis of that. Now, yeah, so it should sound obvious. You can't have a city without infrastructure. So what's so groundbreaking or innovative about that approach? There are, but I'd emphasize here three key points that come out of a focus on the way infrastructure drives urbanization in China. It's not just that you can't have a city without infrastructure, but it's that infrastructure has become the leading edge of urbanization. It's how urbanization, it's how the processes actually happen, and often infrastructure emerges in tandem with or as part of something that fills in the demand for services, for utilities, those kinds of things as cities grow and develop. But here you have fully formed infrastructures, grids that are laid out as the leading edge of urbanization. And urbanization is happening in new and different ways because of the dominant role played by by infrastructure, sorry. So for example, one of my friends, Leonardo Ramondetti, who has written about this issue in the Central Plains of China, he argues that there's a whole new pattern of urbanization that's emerging because of the dominant role that these large-scale infrastructures are playing in shaping these new landscapes. And then we could add, and this is the final point there at the bottom of the slide, that urbanization is happening in these ways because of the ways state power is infrastructural. And the role of the state, of course, always is front and center in how we think about urbanization. Tianxing and others have talked about the urbanization of the local state in China. But if we think about the state in China as an infrastructural state with infrastructural power, then the state's role in urbanization is played out in that way as well, in an infrastructural way. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by these terms of infrastructural state and infrastructural power when we get to talk a little bit more about the concepts that I'm working with. But anytime we talk about infrastructure, there's a couple different levels that we're talking about. And one of the things that we really focused on with the China-Made project was thinking about infrastructure not only as a kind of an empirical or material object that we can look at on the ground, but also an analytical tool, an analytical approach of kind of thinking infrastructurally, of following the infrastructures, of thinking about the kinds of social, cultural, political, economic relationships that swirl around infrastructural formations, and that those can guide us in our analysis. So it's not just that we want to pay attention to what's being built on the ground in built form, but what sorts of effects, what sorts of social relations swirl around those forms. And that's kind of both of those levels are part of what I'm interested in exploring with the concept of infrastructural urbanism. Both affects these new landscapes and these kinds of socio-technical relations and assemblages that emerge from the infrastructure systems themselves. And in this, thinking about infrastructure power in these ways, or infrastructural urbanism in these ways, draws on at least a couple distinct academic genealogies. One is the work that really arguably started by the work of Michael Mann, dating back to 1984, on the infrastructural state and state infrastructural power, and Colin Turner has recently been writing more about this. But the other genealogy comes out of what we might think of as the material turn or the infrastructural turn in the humanities and social sciences that emerged roughly a decade and a half or so ago, perhaps even 2 decades ago, if we kind of look back at some of the early work by Brian Larkin and Penny Harvey and others, which really focused on not so much infrastructure or power of the state, like Michael Mann's work did, but on the agentive powers of material formations on infrastructures as socio-technical assemblages that had certain effects, political effects, techno-political effects, that in many ways went beyond what the state was interested in doing or what the state could control. So with that, let me just go into a little bit more detail on some of these concepts. I'll try to not get bogged down too much in the abstract issues, but I think it's useful to explore these. Infrastructure space is something that we can start with. So, large-scale infrastructure development, much of it has been financed by and built by China, is driving a wave of extended urbanization throughout much of the global South, but it's also changing the way we think about in cities and how we conceptualize urbanization. As I've been alluding to, when we think about infrastructures, we need to think about them as systems of relationships. Infrastructures are not just the material things. They work as relations among users, among different components, both human and non-human. They are much more than their material components, in other words. And because they are relational systems of provision and support, they can be thought of as linking urban centers or urban agglomerations, what we typically think of as the city, to their hinterlands, to broader geography, broader space of provision where raw materials come from, or where people, in terms of mobility, need to go back and forth from. These we can think of as operational landscapes, and are important to state territorial strategies as well. So infrastructures kind of analytically link cities to these broader geographies in ways that make it difficult to kind of separate the city as a distinct space when you think of it linked spatially to these broader landscapes. And in that sense, since we are thinking of a more horizontal unit of analysis that flattens the city and spreads it out across territorial space, that's what this idea of decentering the city is getting at. And so, for example, this quote by Martin Coward, who has been, who's worked on these kinds of things, on how infrastructures decenter the city, leading to a landscape of polycentric and urban agglomerations, and therefore analytically a focus on infrastructures leads us to think about the urban beyond the constraints of the city. And so that's what I'm thinking about when I think about infrastructure space, is these larger scale networks more than just geographical territory that decenter our analysis of the city. Infrastructural urbanism, in the most basic sense, it's just the idea of, as I've been saying, laying out infrastructures that lead or are placed before anything that we might call the urban emerges or the city emerges. It's both a particular spatial pattern of infrastructural-led urbanization, as well as a process of state territorial expansion, integration, and control by using infrastructural power to territorialize space. A lot of this comes out of what David Lampton and his colleagues have recently called the fundamental belief among state actors in China that infrastructural expansion propels broad-based economic growth and needs to run ahead of actual demand for it. And so in those terms, I think of infrastructural urbanism as a manifestation of state infrastructural power. we can think of infrastructural urbanism in both bottom-up and top-down ways. And I can refer to the Pearl River Delta and urbanization in the Pearl River Delta to kind of illustrate this idea. And so maybe the most iconic example of infrastructural urbanism in the Pearl River Delta is the Guangshan Expressway, built by Hopwell Holdings, Gordon Wu and his group. One of the first major expressways to be built in China, one of the first kind of joint venture infrastructural formations that connected Shenzhen to Guangzhou. Let's find myself where I am here in my notes. The largely elevated design of the expressway and the process of land expropriation that cleared the way for its construction offered a model of massive infrastructure investment that has come to signify this China's approach to state-led urbanization. Yet even as this mega project took hold, the Pearl River Delta had already emerged as a kind of a grassroots infrastructural space. Originally, the kind of infrastructural or bottom-up infrastructural urbanism that emerged in the Pearl River Delta was in many ways fundamentally based on the water infrastructures that had been built over centuries there that formed the primary transportation grid throughout the Pearl River Delta. And if those water canals and water-based infrastructures were also the basis for initial territorial or terrestrial, I guess we could call them, infrastructures of the networks of roads and things that then emerged at the local scale that followed a lot of the routes and that were based on a lot of what was going on with the water-based infrastructures. And from those emerged a pattern of kind of bottom-up urbanization, I suppose we could say, that combined small-scale industrialization, lean, the idea of lean factories, lean planning that emerged in this region and became kind of the basis of this unique form of rural urbanization that happened in the Pearl River Delta. And the basic infrastructure expanded. There was, before the Guangshan Expressway, there was a Guangshan Highway that emerged in the region that collected and serviced the commercial needs of the region, transporting goods and people and so on between the different county centers, between the different industrial constellations that were emerging in this area. So we had this kind of this more bottom-up form of infrastructural urbanism emerging, and a series of kind of a certain pattern and landscape of urbanization that came out of that. And of course, then when the Guangshan Expressway was built, its largely elevated design bypassed a lot of that development and signaled an approach which was going to focus more on the kind of the agglomeration centers of Guangzhou and of Shenzhen and perhaps some parts of Dongguan as well. And in some ways, we could think about what was happening with the building of the Guangshan Expressway as an effort to kind of centralize or capture on the part of the central state or higher levels of state actors to capture the infrastructure power of the Pearl River Delta. And so then the Guangshan Expressway becomes more of a top-down form of infrastructural urbanism in which the state is seeking to capture infrastructural power. And perhaps the logical extension or most apparent extension of that idea of the central state capturing infrastructure power in this way comes with a much later development from the same construction firm, and that is the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge that linked Hong Kong to Zhuhai and Macau, and infrastructurally signaled Hong Kong's integration into and in some ways subordination to the larger Pearl River Delta region managed through the infrastructure power of the state and manifest through the construction of that bridge. So I've been talking about the infrastructure power of the state and the infrastructure state. So let me just say a couple quick things about that before moving on to some more specific research on infrastructural urbanism in China. Of course, the idea of the infrastructural state, there's been a lot of interest in this, in the idea that you have recently the emergence of, losing track of my material here, the emergence of more centralized forms of statecraft after decades of neoliberal reform had left many states, not, and here I'm talking beyond China, of course, incapable of undertaking grand spatial kind of infrastructure projects. You have more recently a reconstitution of state power in the context of great power politics, and that has led to the emergence of an infrastructure state. And that much of that has been encouraged by and fueled by China's rise and China's role as a provisioner of infrastructure and an investor in large-scale infrastructures throughout the global South. So I'm not going to say a lot more about the infrastructure state in those terms in the interest of time, but I want to also reference this kind of other body of scholarship through that I'm also working with as I think about these things in China, because of course in China you have to have reference to state power and the infrastructural state, but you also, I think, through this idea of thinking infrastructurally or using infrastructure as a way as an analytical tool, then you also are referencing a body of scholarship that comes out of the infrastructure turn and thinking about politics and thinking about social relations as they swirl around infrastructural configurations. And in some ways, this body of scholarship tries to think of the state and of politics in ways that are not confined to the infrastructure power of the state, but are emergent in infrastructural configurations themselves. And in many ways, these are kinds of political outcomes that are unanticipated or unexpected or cannot necessarily be contained by the state. And I think you end up with both of these kinds of things happening with infrastructural urbanism in China, right? So this is just a way of kind of encapsulating that idea, right? That infrastructure power is not just the state's territorializing capacities, but also the techno-political effects of the infrastructures themselves in shaping social, political, cultural, and economic outcomes. So I'm working with both of these ideas, or both of this idea of state territorial capacity through infrastructure power, but also the power of the infrastructures themselves that are being mobilized by the state. And so let me try to offer a few comments about what that looks like to me empirically in the work that I've been doing in Guizhou, at least up until the pandemic. So as many of you know, I've been working in Guizhou for a long time, and most recently on Gui'an New Area, which is an experimental development zone between the provincial capital of Guiyang and the second largest city in Guizhou, the city of Anshun. It's a experimental zone for data governance, big data centered poverty alleviation, smart city development, focusing on virtual reality and augmented reality and artificial intelligence development. Mostly it's driven by the construction of data storage facilities, data processing centers, but it's also in many ways a kind of an urban planning experiment, and is presented in many ways as a kind of an eco-city, an ideal city to come. And in many ways, the planning around Gui'an and the visions that have been put out there of what Gui'an is supposed to become and is supposed to turn into is this vision of the kind of the ideological city. That's well planned, that is initially laid out by large-scale infrastructure grid like this, but eventually turns into something like this, right? This rendering of kind of the ideal eco-city, and again that idea of the city as an ideological project. But because of the the material power of the infrastructures themselves that are laid out, a different form of kind of infrastructural urbanization or urbanism has been emerging in this place. That is, if not that is quite different from the vision of the city to come that is promised or that is put out there as where Gui'an is supposed to be heading, right? So you have the infrastructural configurations themselves. You have a landscape emerging of diverse land uses, mixed land uses, a mixture of still rural sites, agricultural, residential, industrial, high tech. This kind of pattern of mixed use that emerges from the infrastructures that are laid out. This is the construction of the high-speed rail terminal station in the new area. These are some of the data centers, data storage centers that are literally built into the karst mountains. Part of the reason that Gui'an was selected as a kind of southern China's base for data processing and data storage is the actual material landscape itself, the limestone karst landscape, and the relatively abundant electricity from hydropower in the region made it an ideal place for data servers, which generated a lot of heat, are very energy intensive, and putting them inside of mountains was a way to regulate the temperature and make it easier for a better place to put those. You get these large-scale roads, boulevards that have been laid out, and a lot of that has resulted in the demolition of a lot of villages, a lot of land, a lot of expropriation of land. There is a real focus on the highways as kind of spectacular infrastructures. I should probably say that they have these verdant verges that are well cultivated and well tended, and a lot of people who used to farm the land that the highways run through are now busy gardening the roads themselves, and this kind of elevation of the road as kind of the quintessential space, I suppose, of the zone. The roads have played a significant role in shaping the kind of development that happens. And here we're not just talking about new industrial sites like a Foxconn plant or this kind of the data centers and those kinds of things, but the people who actually live and need to carry out their daily lives in the infrastructure space of the zone have kind of come up with all sorts of livelihood strategies that that may or may not pay off. This is as the whole kind of region moves away from an agricultural-based livelihood pattern to one that is driven by the infrastructures and the infrastructural and the opportunities that those infrastructures bring. You have this kind of odd mixture of different things happening, like this one village that turned itself into a virtual reality theme park, where tourists can come and ride roller coasters, ride virtual roller coasters, I should say, or other forms of kind of whimsical theme parks. This village that turned its land into its own little grassroots, literally grassroots level theme park of world monuments. And here this recalls the theme park image of the Gui'an New Area picture that I showed earlier. And a lot of people who take on livelihoods that are very mobile in terms of moving around to different places, servicing the emerging tourist economy in the area through the provision of snacks or food or those kinds of things. Or here they are near the entrance to a university in the new area, at the university town. And so what I've been interested in finding in this area, what I was finding in my research is a new form of mobility that the infrastructures enable, right? It's much easier to get around in the new area. And that mobility becomes necessary to maintaining some kind of livelihood, whereas previously it was an agricultural and more settled based form of economic activity. It is now one in which circulation throughout the network of the new area is increasingly necessary to maintaining some sort of livelihood, whether it's commuting to a job at the new Foxconn plant, or some sort of small-scale entrepreneurial activity like this, or a kind of an economic activity that is tied to the mobility of people like tourists or others who are moving through the area. So the infrastructural, if we could kind of say the material power of the infrastructural configuration that has been laid out in anticipation of a city to come in Gui'an, has actually led to whole new patterns of labor and labor mobility. And that has become the kind of the dominant outcome of the infrastructural configurations. That's the material effect of the infrastructures themselves. And in some ways, that's quite different from the kind of ideological rendering of what the city, the eco-city, is going to be ultimately in this place. And what I would argue is that something different is emerging altogether, based on the kind of the infrastructural landscape that has been laid out. So let me just, in the interest of time, just wrap those ideas up into a few kind of concluding statements, and then we can have some questions and discussion to perhaps clarify some of these abstract ideas and what I've been trying to say. One of the things I've been interested in is the way that these kinds of infrastructure spaces like Gui'an call for a new lexicon, a new way of talking about what we see happening, as instead of thinking about these as spaces of urbanization, they are infrastructure spaces in which something that is not urban but not rural is emerging. There's a lot of literature in other parts of the world that has explored these kinds of ideas and come up with all sorts of terminologies to talk about these kinds of landscapes, these kinds of formations, from extended urbanization, massive suburbanization. The planetary urbanization crowd call them operational landscapes. Technospheres, the metropolis is Gordon Godillo's version of it. Polycentric urbanism, logistic spaces, horizontal urbanism that I mentioned, Pushpa Arabindu has called them the hinterlands. Abdul Malik Simone has called them the surrounds. Those are all different configurations in certain respects, but they all get at the fact that we've got these kinds of spaces emerging where the categories of urban and urbanization don't adequately express what's happening. They all point toward a decentering of the city in analysis, and a drawing of more attention to material formations and infrastructures as agents of a new morphology of landscape. And I think what we see happening not only within China, but as a result of China's investments in other parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia and perhaps Africa as well, China is a key player in kind of demonstrating a crucial dimension of these processes, which is both state-centric and infrastructurally driven, that you have China kind of fueling the rise of an infrastructure state and state infrastructure power, but that the infrastructural configurations that are being laid out have their own agentive powers and have the power to shape outcomes in particular ways that aren't necessarily, the eco-city that is planned, but something else altogether. And I will leave it at that, and welcome any questions and comments you might have. Thank you.